Good morning folks, 21st Century Caveman here. Hope everybody's safe, hope everybody's well. So today I'm going to be doing a video in which I address the numerous comments and questions which were raised during the course of this build. So I've made quite a few notes on here, so if I'm looking away from the camera, I'm not being rude. I just need a reference point. Okay, now I'm just going to get straight into this because there are quite a few points to cover, and there were lots and lots of questions and queries. Some of them were very similar, so I've just assimilated those, and hopefully my responses will cover a multitude of different queries concerning the same sort of issue. So first of all then, the very first question you've got to ask yourself once you've decided to actually build a structure like this yourself, or whether to pay somebody else to do it, is whether or not you will need planning permission. I'm not talking about building regulations, I'm talking about planning permission. Now, as I say, this is a very first step, because if you go to all of the time and effort, not to mention expense, of building something like this, you don't want to then have to pull the thing down again because you haven't thought it through properly and you haven't gained planning permission when you may need it. Now, it's not for me to give you advice about whether you do, and I'm not going to answer loads of questions about it. You need to do your own due diligence. However, I am pleased to report that there is a plethora of advice and guidance on the web, and in particular there is actually a planning portal which I'll put a link to in the comment section below, so you can actually use that as a reference point. And this does cover a multitude of different projects and gives good examples of situations where you may or may not require planning permission. So it covers common sort of queries as to how large can a bill be, how tall, what percentage of your property or the plot size you're on can it accommodate, how far it needs to be from boundaries, all that good stuff. And also it will also cover building regulations as well, which is a completely separate issue. Now, one of the things I will mention straight away is the fact that if you do contact your local authority, don't always assume that you're speaking to an expert. I was in a situation whereby I had a technical query and I ended up speaking to a customer service advisor, and it turned out they were talking out of their arse basically. I was on a slope, a slight slope, and the question arose as to whether or not the maximum height of this build, at what point the 2.5 metres, you had to consider that. Was it from the highest point or the lowest point? And depending on how far the property and all the rest of it. I did my own research. It turned out the person I spoke to was talking crap basically. So if it doesn't feel right, or if you're getting conflicting information, make sure you speak to an enforcement officer or a planning officer. Don't just assume that the person you're speaking to is fully qualified. So let's get into the nitty-gritty now and actually address some of these questions. So I think the first thing is, with regard to the actual setting out, I would do it slightly different if I do this again, and I'm sure I will. Now, initially I actually had my pegs and my string and measured it, set it out to the best way I thought. But if I do this again, or the advice I would give to somebody doing a build like this is, basically once you've decided on the size of the subframe, knock it up, make sure it's nice and square. The frame, you've got to build the frame anyway, so build the frame first and then lay it out on your plot, and then you can work out where the piers or the concrete supports need to be, rather than faffing around and wasting time like I did initially. Now, the timbers. This is actually quite a big thing, because you do need to shop around for your timbers. Now, if you use DIY stores, places like that, you're going to be paying top dollar for products which aren't necessarily premium products. Okay, you've got to shop around. The cheapest places to buy your timber are timber merchants or builders yards. Now, it seems to be the case, it can be very confusing because different places have just different pricing structures. Some charge per length, typically, so for example, a DIY store or even some timber merchants, they will charge per length, whereas some charge per foot. Okay, so it does get a little bit confusing. So, you need to make sure that the prices you obtain, you're comparing like for like. The other thing is, of course, it might seem common sense, but generally speaking, the longer the length, the cheaper that length of timber. Although, as I say, there are some places that will charge you per foot. So whether you buy 2.4 or 3.6, the actual price per foot or metre, whatever they're charging, might be exactly the same. So that then leads to the issue as to whether or not you buy longer or shorter. Is it something you can collect yourself, or is it something which you need to get delivered? If you're buying longer lengths on the basis that you think you're saving money, then it might be the case that if there's a delivery charge, it may actually negate any saving you might make. The other thing I want to make about, the point I want to make about the timber is the fact that if you decide to go and if you have the facility, so for example if you have a trailer or a truck or a van and you can pick up your own timber rather than getting it delivered, then it might be better selecting it yourself if you've got the time to do that. You may find that if you order 10 lengths of timber and get them delivered, it might well be the case that 2 or 3 of those lengths are about as straight as a hind leg of a dog. They might be so bent, twisted and warped that you can't use them. So therefore you've then got the issue of taking them back and getting all the faff that goes with that. So that's something you do need to think about. Another important point is the fact that if you're doing an external build like this, then always use pressurised treated timber. Okay, so this has been treated against rot. It doesn't need any treating before you use it, although obviously if you want to adopt a belt and braces job you can treat it further, but it's not always necessary. So always use for pressure treated timber. Now there was a query, and 1 or 2 people have commented about the fact that in order to reduce costs I ought to be using or should have used recycled timber, and that's certainly one way of doing it. You can use reclaimed timber and you can get a bit cheaper, but the cost savings and the benefits of doing that aren't always as clear. And the reason to say that is because reclaimed timber can actually be quite expensive in relation to just buying brand new from a timber merchant, for example. And also you might be saving a little bit of money, but clearly the timber's been used before. It might have loads of screw holes, nail holes, the lengths may be completely different. So you've got to work out whether or not it's a good idea to actually use reclaimed timber, and whether or not the small saving you may make is actually worthwhile. Right, so now we'll address the situation regarding the footings. Now, I still maintain that the easiest and cheapest way of creating footings upon which to set the subframe are by using gravel and concrete blocks. And the most expensive way is to actually build a concrete slab, which requires a lot more time, money and expertise. Now obviously if you prepare your land properly and you get it nice and flat, you can actually use concrete slabs. However, you still need to put them on a proper base in order to keep the structure nice and level, and also to stop the subframe from rotting, etc. So yeah, I still definitely maintain that's the best way to do it. There was another query about whether or not the subframe was fixed to the concrete blocks, and the answer to that is no. Absolutely no need whatsoever in this country, in this environment. So this workshop, man cave, shed is actually built in my back garden, so it's largely protected from the elements. We don't have any sort of really terribly adverse weather here in the UK. We certainly don't have hurricanes, typhoons and all that sort of stuff, thank goodness. So this structure, the weight of it in itself is more than sufficient to keep it bedded exactly where it is. This ain't going nowhere. So the answer to that question is no, you do not need to fix a subframe to the concrete blocks. Now there is one change I would like to make if I had to do this again, and what I would do basically is to set the subframe on some damp proof course. So when you see a brick wall, for example, you might see a thick plastic sheet running along the brickwork, you know, very, very close to the ground. So that's a damp proof course basically, and for what it costs, it might actually be worth buying those and just putting it underneath the timbers, the subframe, where it sits on the concrete blocks, just to stop the absorption of water if there's so much water that it absorbs through the concrete block, and actually gets to your timbers. I mean, I think it's unlikely, especially because there's a good distance off the ground there, but do you know what, if I had to do it again for the small amount of extra money it would cost, yeah, I think I'd do it. Right, so now we're going to move on to the floor and the decking, and there were, you know, a few queries about the differences between OSB and plywood, and whether or not it was right to use one as opposed to the other. And I think basically, you know, for a build like this, OSB is perfectly adequate. It's very strong. I'm using structural grade OSB boards here, 18mm thick, so that's perfectly adequate. Suggested ought to use marine ply, which is very expensive, and you don't need to use marine ply, not in this environment anyway. So yeah, OSB is perfectly fine, and also it's a hell of a lot cheaper. Now, is there a right way or a wrong way to put the OSB up? Now, you will find that one of the sides is a little bit smoother. So for example, like this worktop, so I mean, yeah, it's still rough, but it is a bit smoother. And the other edge is a little bit rougher, and that's where you have the actual print on there. So for a floor, I think you ought to have the smooth side facing up, and the rougher side with the print facing down. No, I actually did it the other way around, not really thinking it through at the time. So the reason to say that is because although I've actually painted the floor, because it's quite rough, the raised bits of the floor, they do tend to wear quite a bit quicker. So yeah, I would say definitely where something like the floor is concerned, make sure you have the smooth side up and the stuff with the print on it facing down. Where it comes to the roof, however, I think it needs to be the other way around, and the reason to say that is because when I felted the roof, it would have been the smoother surface of the OSB boards, they didn't grip the felt as well, whereas if it had been, you know, the rough side up, I feel it would have actually gripped the felt a little bit better basically. It's a small thing, but it's something which might be worth thinking about. So yeah, I would definitely do that if I did this again. Okay. On the actual OSB boards again, just to sort of return to the issue of the floor. Now, somebody queried or made a comment about the fact that I'd done a lot of work and I hadn't actually insulated the floor. Now, you've got a single 18mm OSB on the floor here. They've been butted together, and I don't get any drafts here. Now, what I could have done, I could have actually put some flexible frame sealant where the edges of the boards butt up against one another. If I had to do this again, I think I would do it. But like I say, I haven't actually had any drafts, but it may be because of the location. Also, the 18mm, I mean, there's a fair bit of weight in here, to be honest with you, but that's adequate. However, if I was doing this again and I was going to put some heavy machinery or equipment in here, I would definitely double up the boards. If I did this again, I would actually consider putting some insulation on the boards, because to be fair, in winter, you know, the floor can be a little bit cold. One of the reasons is because obviously it's in winter, but also you've got a good ventilation space underneath, so clearly cold air is going to get under there. And I've actually been thinking about this quite a bit, you know, and the comment did actually get me thinking. So yeah, I would put some insulation underneath. I wouldn't use, and what I would actually use is the silver foil, you know, sort of like the bubble pack stuff. So that's what I would actually use if I had to do this again, because I think it would keep the floor a lot warmer and insulate it better, and that would be on the underside of the boards, if that makes sense. Now, there were a number of comments and queries about the benefits of using screws versus nails. Nails are the traditional fixing method, and also they're cheaper. It's a nail and you try and bend it, it's going to be very, very difficult. So that lateral strength is very, very good indeed. Whereas if that was a screw, you can actually break them a lot easier. However, the benefit of a screw is the fact that because it's got those threads, it does pull two pieces of timber together and hold it there a lot better. So the joint is a lot stronger in that respect. So it depends what the application is. I'm more than happy with using screws. I also find that they're easier to use, certainly from my point of view. I mean, I've been using mainly an impact driver, securing the timbers, etc. And screws, for my purposes, they're a lot easier to use, but they are a lot more expensive, as I say. I think one of the issues with hammer and nail is the fact that whilst it's certainly a very acceptable way of securing timbers together, unless you're experienced doing it, I tend to miss the nails quite a bit. I tend to damage the nail heads and also the timber, and especially if you say, for example, fixing noggins to timbers, you know, I don't think it's as accurate for somebody who isn't as experienced using hammer and nails, if that makes sense. So, what else have we got then? So we've talked about the insulating the floor, covered that. Now, one of the other things which I think is very beneficial to have handy when you're doing a build like this, bearing in mind it's something which is going to take a little bit of time, even if you're experienced at doing this sort of thing, if you're an experienced joiner or carpenter, I think you need to make sure you have a decent, well I say decent, a large, reasonably average quality tarp, because the thing is, of course, I mean, you've got to start from the bottom up, and if the weather turns bad, you don't want the timbers to become destroyed or saturated with water. So I think you need to make sure that you have at least one, possibly two nice big tarps available. Now, don't get me wrong, they can be quite expensive. However, I actually was very fortunate enough to pick up two large tarps. They're only about £10 each from B&Q. They were in a sale. I snapped them up knowing that it was going to be, you know, one use only, and then probably end up bunging them actually. But the fact is, they work perfectly. There were several downpours, and had it not been for the fact that I was able to cover this build, then it would have caused a lot of damage. So yeah, you definitely need to get yourself a big tarp, possibly two, depending on the size of the build. On the roof then, it's fair to say that I used far too many clout nails, and yeah, it looked like a drive-by shooting with all those clout nails. I didn't need to use as many as that. I could have secured the felt just as well by spacing them further apart. It would have saved me a few quid, but the cost savings weren't really the issue here. Regarding the felt, it must be said that don't try and cut corners by getting cheapo felt. It's crap. It's like rice paper, it tears easy, it's just not worth it. I used some of the more expensive felt. Now, there were comments about, oh, I should have used you know, some professional grade felt which you apply with a torch and all the rest of it. But look, this is a DIY build. There comes a point where, I mean, look, you can buy tools and equipment for every conceivable thing you do, but the question is whether or not you need it. Is it likely that I'm going to be building this again, or you know, several times? Can I justify the expense of buying all this expensive and fancy equipment? And the answer is no, I don't need to. So yeah, you could do approach it in a multitude of different ways, which are more expensive. They may give you a longer lasting, more professional finish, but the fact is you do what's proportionate to the cost of the build and to your skill set. So that's how I'd address that one. Now, loads and loads of questions about whether or not you need battens on the outside of the build. So basically, you know, once you've put your stud walls up, your framework up, it needs to be, you need to line it with OSB. And I put some feather edge boards on this, but I battened out the OSB first. And this is really important. I've had several questions about whether or not it's actually necessary to put battens on the OSB boards before I say put the feather edge boards, and yes, you do need to do that. Now look, I'm not saying that it won't work if you don't put the battens, but if you, so for example, use feather edge boards or any external cladding and you fix it directly to the OSB boards, you ain't going to have any gap between them, okay? You need to make sure there's some ventilation, there needs to be an airflow, because if you don't, if the actual timbers on the external boards become saturated, that water will actually seep through the timber, and unless you've got a gap there, it's going to cause rot. Simple as that. And also, if you do decide to line the OSB, the external OSB, with a vapour barrier like I did, so it's waterproof but breathable, then you're just going to have zillions of holes in there, which there's no point in doing that, is there? Because if you're going to do that, why bother putting the membrane there in the first place? It's going to have zillions of holes in and it ain't going to be waterproof. So yes, you do need those battens there.